Joining us today is James Bailey. James Bailey is an assistant professor of economics from Creighton University. He specializes, or his work focuses on health economics, labor economics, and entrepreneurship. And today he's going to talk through his paper on regulation's effect on entrepreneurship. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bailey. Nice to be here.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for reading the paper. That's actually pretty cool. I don't know if you know how academia really works, but we tend to write papers and have them read by 5 other people who are all professors, right? And so if even half of you did the reading, I'm way ahead on being a normal professor doing a normal paper. So, and yet it seemed like you had a lot of questions that I think taught me that I have some more explaining to do with the paper. What you saw was somewhat, not an early draft, but a middling draft, and so I'm still improving it, and I think your feedback is going to help there. So, I wanted to motivate this paper in a little different way. What I want to know is what the effect of all these regulations we're passing is, and what they're doing to entrepreneurship, what they're doing to other things. But in order to understand why that might be really important, I think you got to understand first how prevalent, how common regulation is, right? So whenever the federal government or some agency of the federal government comes up with a new regulation that's going to be the new sort of law of the land, it ends up going in the Code of Federal Regulations, right? And we've been doing this sort of thing for decades and decades, right? And we tend to add a lot of regulations, tend not to get rid of the old ones, right? And so they accumulate over time, and they accumulate into this, right? So this is what happens when you try to print out the entire Code of Federal Regulations, right? It's pretty huge. Here's another way of looking at it, right? 24 feet tall. So this presents a couple challenges, right? So one, as a business or just a person, right? How are you supposed to understand, what it is that you're doing, right? How do you know when you're doing something that's illegal? Right? And it's presenting a challenge as a researcher, like me, trying to figure out what's going on here. I want to know what regulation does. Well, how am I supposed to understand what regulation is when it's, if I were to try to read this, it would be, a year or two, right? And I honestly probably wouldn't understand a lot of it, right? So I want to know what all this is doing, okay? Regulation, it accumulates over time. So here's the number of words. We are now over 100 million words in the Federal Register, right? So we are way beyond War and Peace territory here, right? Way beyond, the last book of Harry Potter, right? This is pretty serious. This is not something you're just going to be able to read in a day or a week or a semester, right? And yet we have to find some way to figure out, this. Just because nobody can read all of it doesn't mean it's not having an effect, right? There are pieces of this that end up being really important to different industries, and we want to know how exactly what all this is doing. Okay. So I want to know what all this is doing, right? And in particular, there's this common idea of regulation hurting business, and I want to know, well, does it really do that? How much? How much is business really hurt by having to comply with this 24 feet of regulation? And if it does hurt businesses, which ones? Or does it hurt some kinds of businesses and not others? Right? So that's the big question I want to figure out. One way to start to figure out these things is to theorize about this, right? Popular tool in economics as well as philosophy. You just try to think through the problem. Later I'm going to go to the data, but what we do a little bit in the paper, probably should have done more of, I realize after reading your questions, is just sort of think through it. Before we look at the data, what would we expect all this regulation to be doing, right? And so one way to look at regulation, maybe the simplest way, is that it's how regulation should affect business is that it's increasing the cost of doing business. Right? So when you're running your business, there are all these things that you might have to do that you wouldn't have wanted to do if you were left to your own, but now the government's telling you have to. Right? So for instance, you've got your coal-fired power plant, you're trying to produce electricity, and now the government's telling you need to do this more cleanly, right? So you need to put these carbon scrubbers at the top of your stacks, right? And that's going to add to your costs. And we want to know what the effect of that is. Well, in economics, increasing a business's cost is this pretty straightforward thing. We'd say you're decreasing the supply in the market. You're shifting the supply curve left. I don't know how many of you have taken intro economics. You're mostly in philosophy, right? So, that's not too important here. But we think we understand pretty well what the result is of shifting supply left, of raising costs, right? And it's that prices go up, right? So consumers are going to pay higher prices. Quantity will go down. So whatever market this is, the quantity of goods they produce is lower. So if this is electricity, right, and we have this regulation that increases costs, we expect to see higher prices, so consumers are paying more. And then as prices are higher, their consumers are buying less, right? So less electricity is getting produced and consumed. And then you might think higher prices are good for businesses, but when these higher prices are coming because of higher costs, profits are going down as well, right? So the most straightforward thing you expect to see is prices go up, quantities go down, profits go down. So it's sort of bad for consumers in the industry, bad for producers in the industry, maybe, right? And then, of course, we expect to see some offsetting benefits, right? So the government isn't passing these regulations just because they hate business and want to make things hard for business, for the most part, right? They have some reason that they thought that passing this regulation was a good idea, right? So there are going to be some costs, and then there are going to be some offsetting benefits, which could be various. So in my smokestack example, there's the benefit of not producing so much pollution, right? Well, that's good. And it's sort of helping people in general, even if it's hurting people in this specific electric market, right? So some regulations are trying to improve environmental quality. Some might try to increase the quality of goods. So, I'm mostly a health economist, and so I think a lot about health insurance. There are lots and lots of regulations saying the minimum things that health insurance has to include, right? And so that's making health insurance more expensive when you make it cover more things, but it's also making it higher quality. Right? So there's sort of this trade-off here. And then likewise, a lot of regulations have to do with working conditions, right? So you're specifying how much workers need to be paid, or how much time off they have to get, or that you have to give them workers' comp, or that you have to have safe working conditions, right? So there are all these things that they're going to have a cost to the business to provide to workers, and that cost is probably going to end up passed on to consumers, right? But then, of course, there are the benefits of workers getting sort of more breaks, or workers' comp, or safety, right? So for the most part, for this paper, I'm going to leave those benefits to one side and really just focus on the cost side and try to figure out exactly how big are the costs, right? But just to make things interesting, right? Just because a regulation hurts some firms, raises the costs of doing business for some firms, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to hurt everybody, right? And I think this can be true in two different ways, that regulation can end up helping businesses, or some businesses, in about two different ways. The more straightforward way that regulation can end up benefiting your firm is if it hurts your competitors and doesn't affect you, right? So if there's some regulation that's passed that raises your rival's costs, your competitor's costs, but doesn't apply to you, you've kind of got it easy, And so there are lots of examples of this. In New Orleans right now, Uber is trying to bring easy, cheap car service to the city, and taxi companies aren't happy about this because it's new competition for them, right? And so they would like the city council to have all these regulations making it harder for Uber to do business, right? And I'm sure they'd enjoy having regulations that apply to Uber that don't apply to taxis. Say, oh, car services are different, they need harder regulations, or it's different because you're getting a car from an app that needs harder regulations, right? They should have to buy more insurance than we do, or have different background checks or something, right? So if you can get regulations that only apply to your competitors, that's pretty good for you as a business, right? Big tobacco trying to say, e-cigarettes need to be regulated too, maybe harder than us, right? You want to shut down this new innovative competitor with some regulations that only apply to them. Airlines in the US are really brazen about this, right? I don't think this is very common knowledge, but so foreign airlines, right? You can go get a flight on, Air France that'll take you to France. You can go on a flight, out of New Orleans airport, get a flight from Air France to take you to Mexico, right? But you can't go out of New Orleans Airport and get a flight on Air France to take you to Dallas or New York City or anywhere in the US, unless it's a code share, right? It has to really be an American airline because we've got these rules that foreign airlines aren't allowed to fly between cities in the US, right? So if you're a foreign airline, that's bad for you. You know, there's this regulation keeping you from selling some product you'd like to sell. But if you're an American airline, that's great. You know, you've got the law on your side, keeping away your competition, making things easier for you, right? And when you have less competition, you can raise your prices, right? And hurt consumers. But so U.S. airlines do this, and we have this in shipping as well, right? So some foreign shipping company like Maersk, they can take big container ships from all over the world and bring them into the port of New Orleans. And unload everything, and they can take things from the port of New Orleans and bring it all over the world, but they're not allowed to bring anything from the port of New Orleans to the port of Houston or New York, right? Because they're foreign, right? So existing domestic shippers and airlines are really happy about this. If you can raise your rivals' costs and have these regulations that don't hurt you, you're better off, right? So some firms can benefit. Where things get really interesting and a little tricky, right? It's possible that you could even benefit from a regulation that is targeted at you and that does raise your cost, as long as it ends up hurting your rivals more than it hurts you, right? So this is a little tricky. You have to think of, in this case, you got to think of markets as being sort of like a real competitive sport, right? So if you're in competition, you can end up benefiting from getting hurt a little if your opponents get hurt more, right? I should deal with this first point first. Okay, so regulations, right? So they increase the cost of doing business, right? But they might increase the cost of doing business in this very specific way, right? So what some of them probably do is increase fixed costs, right? Where fixed costs are sort of like startup costs, the cost of making the first unit of something. All these costs you have to do really before you start producing en masse. So I always think about T-shirts here as the simple example. So if you've ever tried to order screen-printed T-shirts, right? There's going to be some big setup fee for them setting up the screen printer to do whatever your design is, and then there's going to be some per T-shirt fee that's really low, right? So maybe it's going to cost like $100 to set up the screen printer if you want to do one shirt like this, and then for every other shirt you do, it's just going to cost $3. Right? Because T-shirts are cheap and doing this is cheap, right? But setting up in the first place is expensive, right? So there's this big fixed cost to producing the first one, but after that, each the second and the fifth and the 100th one you produce is a little cheaper. And so in a world like that, in a world where there's some big fixed cost or setup cost, you're going to be better off the more you can produce, right? The more you can spread out this initial cost over producing lots of new things. So T-shirts work that way. Any big manufacturing thing, like making cars, works that way, where it's efficient to have this really big plant. So with car manufacturing, right, it's really hard to have a tiny car company. It's really hard to have a company that makes 100 cars a year. Those cars are going to be really expensive. You have to make them all by hand or something. What you want to do is set up a big assembly line factory with robots and everything that can easily make, like 100,000 or 1 million cars a year. So you want to set up this big factory, and so there are these big fixed costs. Making that first car is really expensive. Making the 100,000th car isn't so expensive because you're spreading out this big initial fixed cost over lots of production. Okay? So fixed costs come about for lots of reasons, right? Often they're coming really out of the way the production process just works. And it's often the case that you can try to spread out these fixed costs by producing more. So, electric companies too. Why is there only Entergy in town? Why is there usually only one big power company? Well, they have to pay these huge fixed costs of setting up these power lines that go everywhere in town. And once you do that, it's pretty cheap to provide the electricity. But so there's these big costs to sort of setting up, and once you do that, it's good to be big. It's good to produce a lot. So fixed costs happen for all kinds of reasons. Regulation is one reason that fixed costs might happen. Right? So the pharmaceutical industry is probably a really good example here. So if you want to produce a new drug, you have to get it through the FDA's drug trial, drug approval process, right? Which is going to take you 8 to 10 years, and it's going to take you about $1 billion. Right? And you have to do all that before you can sell your first pill. Right? So it's going to cost you $1 billion in 8 years to produce pill number 1, and then it's going to cost you about 50 cents to produce pill number 2. Right? So if you only produce 2 pills, the average cost is $500 million for each of those pills. But if you keep producing, you can spread out that $1 billion over more and more and more pills. Right? And so here, the fixed cost it's coming from this regulation, this fact that you need to get through these years and years of expensive trials before you can produce. Right? Maybe it's good regulation, right? Because we are learning things along the way, right? So maybe there are big benefits to this regulation, right? But there are clearly big costs, right? That it's going to take so much time and money to produce these things, right? And because of these costs, and because they're fixed costs, companies want to be big, right? So it's really hard to sell a small pharma, or to have a small pharmaceutical company. If you want to do this, if you're a brilliant biochemist in the making, you can develop your drug on your own for a little while, but you're not going to get it to market yourself. That's just not going to happen because it takes $1 billion. Where are you going to get $1 billion from? What you do is you develop your drug for a little while and then you sell it to some big pharmaceutical company, for like $10 million or something. Then they put in the other $1 billion to get it through trials, and then they make $5 billion or however much they make from actually selling it. Right? So fixed costs mean you want to be big. Sometimes fixed costs can come from regulation. Right? And where things get really interesting, sort of combining all of these insights, is in a world where regulation can create fixed costs, you can actually benefit from a regulation even if it raises your own costs, as long as it hurts your competitors more. Right? So maybe to start with sports analogies, right? So in football, right? If it starts raining, this is going to hurt your running game. It's going to hurt the passing game more. So if you're more of a running team, your opponent's more of a passing team, you can benefit from the rain, even though it hurts your score, because it's going to hurt your opponent's score more. Or to get more directly at this regulation, right? Think about rule changes in the game, right? So we get the Calvin Johnson rule. You have to control the ball all the way to the ground. It gets a little harder to score points in the NFL. So it's harder for you to score points. Does that mean it's a bad rule? Well, maybe, right? Your goal isn't really to score as many points as possible. It's to score more than your opponent. And so, really it's a bad rule for you if it hurts you more than your opponent. But if your opponent was relying more on receiving, right, maybe it's a good rule for you. Right? And so maybe you're happy about the Calvin Johnson rule if you're not Calvin Johnson or Des Bryant. Right? So market competition can work a little bit like this. Sports analogies aren't always the best because markets, sometimes both sides really can win. But in this case, I think they're pretty good. Right? And taxi companies, to go back and pick on taxis, will often do something like this. Right? So a lot of cities will have taxi regulations saying that if you want to have a taxi company, it's got to operate all the time and it's got to operate everywhere. Right? And the reasoning people will give for this is, this is how we're going to serve consumers better. Right? We need to make sure that consumers can get a ride even if it's 3 a.m. So similar to the taxis, but maybe more important and more broadly, like all the federal regulations I'm talking about, when you start a company nowadays in finance, there are all these reporting requirements. In 2002, we did Sarbanes-Oxley, making public companies generally do a lot more reporting, and now after 2010, with the Dodd-Frank law, we've got finance companies doing all sorts of reporting. So you've got to have at minimum one, probably a lot of full-time lawyers and accountants, and you have to spread your, you have to pay for them somehow, right? And the easiest way to do that is to have a really big business producing a lot of things and being able to support them. If you have a business with 2 people, and you've got your lawyer and your accountant handling your finances, you're already done. If you have a business with 100 people, you can sort of afford to pay for a lawyer and accountant dealing with all your bookkeeping. So this is the theory we've been thinking about, right? That regulation is going to have these costs, but it could, in a way, benefit some of the bigger companies, and we want to know what's actually going on out there, so we can turn to the data, see what's really happening. And so we need data on regulation, and we need data on what's happening with businesses. So our business data comes from the Census Bureau. They get information on basically every legitimate business out there. Anytime you're going out and hiring somebody and reporting about their unemployment benefits, the census knows about it. So they know how many firms are out there, how big they are, which firms are starting and dying, and which are hiring people and which are firing people. And we can see this all through different states and different parts of industry. So what we have here is data going back to the late 90s that cuts the US into 200-something different industries. And so we can see which industries are hiring, which industries are firing, which industries are starting lots of new businesses, and which industries are the new businesses dying. And what we're going to want to do is match this to data on regulation, so we can see if the more regulated businesses are hiring more or hiring less. And this is the data you've already seen. Right? And this brings us to the regulatory data. Right? So I think that's good. Reg data, where they go comb through the code of federal regulations. Right? And the really interesting thing here, right? So remember back to the 24 feet of regulations, nobody can just read it and understand it. So how are you going to get an idea of what's going on, right? So in particular, what we want to figure out is a measure of how regulated different industries are, right? So what we're really trying to do here is look at these 200-something different industries, and then say which ones are really highly regulated, right, and which ones are really lightly regulated, and see do the highly regulated industries seem to be being hurt by this regulation, right? And is it hurting all the firms or just the small firms? Right? So in order to do that, we want to get our measures of how different industries are doing, okay, and we got that. And then we want to get our measures of how regulated the different industries are, and that's what this reg data is about. Okay? But in order to do this, it's hard to figure out. So what these guys did is they used these new text analysis machine learning techniques to go comb through this, 100 million words, and figure out how regulated different industries are, which is a bit of computer science wizardry that I don't know if I totally trust or understand yet. But basically they take the descriptions of different industries that come from the people who categorize firms into different industries, right? And then you look through the Code of Federal Regulations, or your computer program looks through, and figures out if it's seeing those words. If there are all these words used to describe what it's like, what firms fall into the airline industry, right? And you see those words about airlines on a page, you think, okay, we're talking about the airline industry here. And then we want to look for measures of how regulated they are, right? And so what they end up doing is looking for what they call binding constraints. So you want to find these words about the airline industry, so you know that's being talked about, and you want to find them near binding constraints. So saying airlines shall, airlines must, airlines are required to, right? And so if you're seeing airlines all the time and you're seeing may not all the time, right? You get this idea of that they're pretty regulated, right? And we're kind of out on a limb here, right? That's like, you can imagine lots of misclassification happening, but basically, when you're dealing with 100 million words, I don't know what else to do. And our excuse as academics, right, is that sometimes we use the excuse that everybody else was doing it, or all the cool kids were doing it. Sometimes we use the excuse, I think the better excuse, that, well, everybody else was doing something even worse, right? So our measure here of how regulated different industries are is a little crude, but like if you look back at what other people were doing, man, it was even worse. People would just famous people would go get data on how big the file size was in different states, like the computer file size for how many kilobytes their document describing the regulations was. And it's like compression algorithms, people deciding to include pictures versus not, right? That's probably what's driving this, rather than really differences in regulation. So we did something sketchy, but everybody else was doing something worse. So it's okay. It's okay that we jumped off the bridge. Okay, so I want to bring a little bit more of the data here, so I think you can get a better picture of what's going on. So here are some of the industries. These are 3-digit NAICS industries, so we're using things that are a little more fine-grained than this. But so there are some different industries like furniture, machinery, air transport, hospitals, and these are the measures of regulation. Okay. So the algorithm does its text analysis. It combs through all the 100 million words, and it figures out which industries are highly regulated and which are lightly regulated. And these are the extremes. So on the left, we have the 5 least regulated industries, and on the right, we have the 5 most regulated industries. And I think this kind of validates, the exercise a little bit. At least to me, it does. So, so this crazy computer program went through 100 million pages. Did it do anything useful? Well, this kind of makes sense to me. I look at those industries on the left, and I think, yeah, I can't think of many furniture-related regulations. And I look at the ones on the right, and I think, yes, I can think of a lot of regulations about air transport. Every time I fly, they seem to list off a bunch of them at me. It's like, yes, I was not planning on disabling the smoke detector, thank you. And hospitals, right? Lots and lots of regulations about hospitals. Go try setting up your own hospital, right? Good luck. There's a lot you're gonna have to do, right? And finance is now getting more and more regulated. They just, hospitals, with the Affordable Care Act and finance with Dodd-Frank, they each both got some 2,000-page bills from Congress that are going to get turned into many, many more 1,000 pages of regulation through the federal regulatory agencies. So I think this makes sense, and I hope this gives you a better picture of what's going on with the different industries. Okay. And again, to try to get a better picture here, these are the most these are the federal agencies that are putting out the most regulations, right? So there are lots and lots of federal agencies out there. There's the alphabet soup of different federal agencies, but some of them don't do much regulation. Some do a lot. So these are the ones that do the most. So environmental protection, right? Really, really common. So telling people how to dispose of their dangerous chemicals, telling every manufacturer and power plant what they need to do with their smokestacks, all that kind of thing. Homeland Security is a big new one. IRS, lots of regulations. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazard. That's where a lot of the worker-related regulations are coming from. Saying how workers need to be protected. We've got the FCC saying what can go on television and radio. We've got the FAA. Regulating planes, food and drug, regulating pharmaceuticals and food. Right? And so these are the big agencies, and again, I hope this gives you a little bit of a picture of what kind of regulations are. Right? So we are looking at regulation at a really big level, high level, like big picture, like all regulations combined. Right? And it's almost hard when you abstract that far and lump that many different regulations together to think, well, what is a regulation? Right? They're all so different from each other, and I think you might have had trouble thinking what's really going on here, what's like a specific example, right? But I think when you look at these agencies, you probably know what most of them do. You imagine, okay, you kind of know what the EPA is telling people. You kind of know what the IRS is telling people to do and not to do. Okay. And this kind of looks like the graph from the beginning. This is, but this is just saying, at the beginning you could see that the word count was going up and up over time. This is, we do our fancy measure, and we can say not just the total word count, but also all these restrictions are going up over time. So we think regulation really is getting more restrictive over time. We want to know what this is doing. Then we do, okay, you sort of have to do this as an economist nowadays. We do our statistical analysis, right? So we've got our data about regulation. We've got our data about businesses hiring and firing and starting and dying. And we want to figure out to what extent that regulation and in what direction that regulation is affecting businesses. Right? So we do a regression analysis. Right? And what I want you to think about is drawing a scatter plot. Right? So trying to plot different industries, and you see how regulated they are and what employment is like. Right? So you can do this for all these different industries, and you can try to draw a line through the scatter plot. So it's like drawing a line of best fit through a scatter plot. Right? That's a unidimensional regression. Then we do a multivariate one, which is sort of like, well, drawing a line through a many-dimensional scatter plot. But don't worry about the details, unless they sound like interesting details, in which case go take statistics and econometrics. They're fun and marketable. But so we do this. We look through the data to try to figure out to what extent are we seeing more regulation associated with more or fewer businesses starting, more or fewer businesses ending, right? And hiring. Okay. So we do that. We run our regressions, and we see what happens. Okay. I mean, you saw these. These are what's happening to firm births, and these can be kind of interpreted as percentages. And so you want to look at that line that says regulatory index. So we're looking at the effect of increases in the regulatory index on firm births, and so increasing the regulatory index seems to decrease firm births overall. So fewer businesses are starting when we have more regulation. Decrease firm births among small businesses, but not decrease them among large businesses in a significant way. So the stars indicate statistical significance. So where you see the stars, we think that's like a real effect. Where you don't see stars, that seems like it's something that might have just happened by chance, right? And it wasn't a real effect. Okay. So regulation seems to lead to fewer businesses being started overall and in small firms. It doesn't seem to be killing off existing businesses. So it seems like once you're in, you're sort of good. And in fact, if you're a large existing business, regulation might actually help you, right? So that 1 star indicates it's sort of on the edge of being statistically significant. It might be a real effect. It might just be due to chance. So there's definitely no increase in firm deaths from regulation here, right? There might be a decrease. So you might actually be safer as a big firm in a more regulated industry. And this is going back to that story at the beginning about fixed costs. Sort of they hurt you a little bit as a big firm, but you can take it. What they really do is squash the little guy, or especially squash the guy who hasn't started a business yet. He's thinking about it, and then he sees all this red tape and says, I don't want to deal with that, or I can't deal with that. Right? So you might actually be safer as a large business. Okay. And then what does this do to hiring? It looks like, in general, more regulated industries aren't hiring as many people. Right? Presumably their costs went up. They're not going to get as much out of hiring more workers. Either workers got more expensive directly, maybe because of OSHA regulation, or maybe the regulations just made your whole process more costly, so you're cutting back, right? And that means you cut back on hiring. Okay. And we see if this regulation takes a little bit a year to take effect, and get similar results. Okay. So in conclusion, right, it looks like a 10% increase in regulation will lead to a small reduction in new firm births, small reduction in hiring. And so if you add this up, you look at, well, over the whole period we have in our data, we saw a 24% increase in regulation. Right now you're starting to get to pretty noticeable reductions in new firms entering the market and in hiring people. Right? So that's our real conclusion. Right? And then you might wonder, so what? What do we do about it? I saw some of your questions, and I thought this was one of the common themes, and you're very right to ask this. We should have dealt with this in the paper before, right? So regulation is maybe stopping new businesses and maybe stopping some hiring. So what? Right? Well, one possibility is so nothing, right? Because we were only doing half of the equation, right? If you want to figure out whether regulation's worth it, you got to figure out the costs and the benefits, right? This paper is just a start, right? We've got some idea of the costs of regulation, right? In that we're going to get fewer startups and fewer hires. But we didn't calculate the benefits at all, right? Maybe, having a safer environment is worth all of this, right? It's worth a few people not being able to get jobs, right? Or maybe it's not. We don't know. We can't say just based on what we did in our paper, right? All we can say is, well, the costs are there. maybe the benefits are there too, maybe the benefits are bigger, maybe they're smaller. Right? Okay, but if you assume that, or if you're just focusing on the costs that we found, right, or for some other reason you're convinced that we do have too much regulation in the US and it's something we should do something to reduce, right? What exactly do we do? That's not the focus of the paper. I don't have great ideas here, but the two big things that came to mind here, one was a page limit, right? Like maybe 100 million words should just be the max, right? Or 25 feet worth of printed pages should be the max, right? And you should realize that no person is going to be able to understand all that, so we need to have some artificial limit. Anytime an agency decides they want to add to regulation, they need to figure out what regulation that's in there that they want to repeal in order to make room for it. And if we can't fit all the regulations we need into 100 million words, that just seems absurd, right? That's what I really like to do. I don't think that's happening. Something that's a little more realistic, right, is to strengthen the regulatory review process, right? So regulation's a little weird. It's not laws, right? So it's not that Congress has passed 100 million words worth of laws, and that's what we're talking about, right? So Congress has passed laws that authorize all these federal agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency, to exist and to make their own regulations, right? And so this is like civil servants or bureaucrats, depending on whether you like them or not, at the EPA and all these other agencies, coming up with their ideas of how they're going to regulate pollution and writing them into law, right? But there are some rules, right? So they don't just have the infinite power to make up whatever regulations they want and put them in right away. There was some congressional authorization that was narrow. And then they need to get through this whole review process that each administration sets up, right? And right now, if the regulation is going to have a big impact, right, more than $100 million impact, they have to do this review process with a cost-benefit analysis. So they have to try to look at this specific regulation and come up with how big the costs are, how big the benefits are. Then they need to send it on to OIRA, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, so a different part of the administration that needs to approve all these big regulations, right? And I get the feeling that the people at OIRA are really skeptical about all these regulations, right? But don't really have the power to just kill everything they want to kill, which, when I put it that way, maybe sounds good. Keep them from a killing spree. But they're supposed to be the last round of review here, making sure these regulations are good regulations, and they mostly just let things pass, right? So maybe if we empowered the people who have to review these regulations before they're final, you could kill off some of the more costly ones or the less beneficial ones. All right. So that was enough from me. I would like to hear from you. If you've got any questions, any comments, I tried to address some of your questions, but I know I didn't get to all of them. So I'd be happy to be reminded about things that you wrote before or new questions you have.
I still don't understand the tables. Could you maybe explain how the statistics in the text relates to what's in the tables? Because I just don't see where the 10% is, the 0.5.
Yes. Yeah. So the 0.5 is it's rounding from the 0.049.
Okay.
So what's happening is it's from the way our variables are set up. So the regulatory index, we took the natural log of it, which is okay. So the regulatory index, it's a little bit meaningless in itself. Right? So if you have a regulatory index of 10,000, that doesn't really mean anything in and of itself. That's very important. But the order matters, right? So it doesn't really matter that your regulatory index is 10,000, but we know that 10,000 is bigger than another industry that has an index of 5,000. So what we try to do is take this regulatory index, which is a little bit arbitrary, and transform it into something that's a little easier to use or a little bit more meaningful. Because if we told you, if we talked about what happens when you increase the index by 5,000, that would be a little weird. So we try to talk about increasing it by 10%. And so to do that, we take the natural log, so it's a mathematical transformation. And once you do that, it means you can interpret these numbers as percentage changes. So the minus 0.049 means like a 4.9% decrease for each 10% change there. Sorry, 0.49%.
Wait, so shouldn't that be 5% decrease then? I mean, I'm just reading that as 5%.
Yeah,
And
so it would be 5% if we had a 100% increase in the regulatory index.
Okay. And so that's just like one of the assumptions or the underlying parts of the equation, or?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Okay.
It's coming out of the fact that, this is a variable that we've taken the natural log of, and this is a absolute number.
So it's 5% as compared to regulatory index, but overall it's 0.5.
No, so it's about how big the increase is, right? So if we doubled the amount of regulation, you'd see a 5% decrease in the number of firms, so 100% increase, 5% decrease.
Okay.
So I was just scaling that down to something more realistic. It's weird. It's
Okay.
weird to think about
I
doubling.
understand now.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so the 10% was just arbitrary.
Yes.
It was just a proxy to, okay.
Yep.
I get it now.
I do wonder how often, we do double regulation though. Maybe it's not as unrealistic as I think.
I had a sort of unrelated question to what you had in the paper. It was on the anti-commons. And I was wondering if you could maybe give me examples of what you were thinking of. Because the only thing that I could come up with was patents.
Yeah, and that is the classic example actually. So
Okay.
I have to say, so co-authoring, right? So this is this paper. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. It was on the slide, but this paper is joint with Deanna Thomas, who's also a professor at Creighton University, and I'm sort of the numbers person, right? So I did all the statistical analysis here, and she is like theory person, so she knows all about public choice economics, and so she wrote about the anti-commons, right?
Okay.
And so the one big thing I do know about the anti-commons is patent thickets, right? So the tragedy of the commons is when there aren't property rights, people will overuse things. So the name comes from medieval England or early modern England, where there's a common green in the middle of town, and anybody can go graze their sheep there, and because anybody can go graze their sheep there, everybody grazes their sheep there until it's this barren, no longer green thing, and all the grass is gone. Whereas if we just fence it all off and give each person a little bit, they won't overgraze it. Right? The reason they overgraze is because they got to get the grass before somebody else does. So the tragedy of the commons is this somewhat common idea in economics now, right? That when there aren't property rights, people will overuse things. The flip side of that is that it's possible to have too many property rights, and when you have too many property rights, you can have people underusing things. Right? So that might be the case with patents nowadays, where in general, we think patents are good. They give you property rights to your idea, and so you have an incentive to develop it, right? But if you're in this world where everybody has already created these ideas and they all have patents, if you want to do anything new, you might have to use this property from like 100 different people who came up with 100 different patented ideas. And so you have to try to negotiate with 100 different people about licensing their idea, which is tough. Right? And so you can actually get slowed down and underuse these valuable resources because there are like too many property rights assigned, and negotiation is hard. Transactions costs exist. So that's the anti-commons in general. What we tried to do with this paper was apply the idea to regulators, right? Where maybe like if there are lots and lots of different regulators, right, it's like there are all these people who are toll booth collectors. Everybody's trying to get something out of this industry, and when there's one toll booth you have to go through, you just pay it. But when there are 50 toll booths, you might just say, forget about it, right? And so we were looking for this effect of more regulators, more, like having 50 different regulators that all want something from your industry. We thought that could be a big problem, and we looked for it and we couldn't really find it. Yeah.
I know that you found that small businesses were more affected by regulation than large businesses. Did you find any different areas that were more affected than others? You know, were hospitals more affected, being higher regulated, or, I mean, were there just some types of industry that seemed disproportionately affected as opposed
We
as compared to
haven't
others?
tried that yet. That's a good idea. That's a very good idea. Yeah. In particular, yeah, we could try to break things up into like manufacturing versus services, or break things up into maybe 5 or 10 different industries.
Because I know your paper said that high-entry businesses were affected less than low-entry businesses, but I didn't know.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean, as far as startup costs.
that was somebody else's paper. You know, Jankov, I think. You know, some other author was you know, looking at high entry versus low entry. We didn't do that directly anyway. You know, we've just got big and small for now. But you know, like I said, the paper's not done yet. You know, we're actually revising it right now for the Mercatus Center, who we're working with it on, and you know, so we're trying to figure out, you know, how to make this better, and yeah, I think that would be really interesting. Yeah. So does it affect?
Like machine-based industries sometimes versus people-based industries. You know, hospitals have machinery, but
Yep.
it's a heavier amount of people that you would need. You know, would that be more affected than a manufacturing industry where the startup cost is higher for a different reason?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I know at one point we sort of did the flip side of that, and we looked to see if different regulators had bigger or smaller effects. You know, so we looked at the 3 or 4 biggest regulators, like the EPA and Homeland Security, and saw like, was one of them having an especially strong effect on, you know, shutting down hiring. We didn't see anything there. So yeah, I like your idea.
So what about policy implications? Because I could imagine that there are certain cases where I might want a higher barrier to entry to some businesses.
Yeah.
So a restaurant, for instance, in many cases, I've eaten a lot of street food in a lot of places that's pretty good, but you know, there's something about making sure that startup costs are high enough so that people are perhaps taking things seriously. Or,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what would you say to something like that, that maybe a higher startup cost in some businesses, be it maybe not restaurants, but somewhere else, it benefits the consumers?
Yeah. So, well, what people always say about when you're the one trying to get these regulations passed in your own industry, you say, I like free markets. I'm a businessman. I like this in general, but in my industry, there are just these fly-by-night competitors, and we need to do something about them. And in general, I think that's a self-serving argument because the regulations kind of benefit these incumbents. But sometimes there really are fly-by-night competitors doing shady things that hurt people. So I think occasionally having fewer firms really is the way to go. To take it to an extreme, how many firms do we want involved in contracting to build nuclear weapons, right? Probably as few as possible. Right? As industries get more and more sensitive, more and more able to hurt people by screwing up a little, then yeah, I think that can make sense. But people make the same argument in every industry, sort of regardless of whether it makes sense or not.
So how might we separate out the industries where it's okay from the industries where it's perhaps not okay?
Yeah. So whether it can kill people or not, I think that's a good one. Or how easily it can kill people, and how easily people can figure out quality for themselves. Right. So restaurants, people do get food poisoning, but it's pretty rare, and you're pretty good if you go to a restaurant once, you can judge its quality for yourself. So I think we don't need so much regulation there. Whereas if you look at medicine, right, bad medicine really can kill you, or the lack of good medicine really can kill you. And it's a lot harder for consumers to figure out a good doctor versus a bad doctor, because sometimes the good doctor really can't fix you, and sometimes if you go see a bad doctor, you'll get better on your own anyway. So there's just so much noise and randomness in the process that it's harder to figure out. But basically, any business that has a good following on Yelp, right? People can probably figure it out on their own. And yet there's a ton of regulation on. It's a little hard to start a restaurant. There are a lot of licenses to start hair braiding, start a barber shop. Even though you can figure out pretty quickly if you got a bad haircut, and he's bad, but you're not dead when you get an ugly haircut.
Did you see anything on firing data, or is that possible?
Yes,
Because
we have
that
it.
seemed to be a good problem.
Yeah, that's something we could put in.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got hiring and firing, new firms and old firms. We've got the total number of existing employees in existing firms, and we've got the other sizes too. Like here, we're just using really small and really big firms, but we do have everybody in the middle too. But yeah, firing would probably be one of the best. That would be a good addition as well. So yeah. I should have brought my notepad, but I guess it's being recorded, so I'll just look back.
And then also, is there any way, because this seems like a pretty short-term study too, is there any way that you can get further back, or is there any way that you can assess like the long-term health of these companies? Because a lot of the big companies, they can survive for a long time because they've amassed profits, but that doesn't mean that they're healthy companies.
Yep. We'd have to use different data sets to go back. In particular, this regulation data set's only going back to 97, and I don't know why they stopped there. I think that might be, I think before that, there might not be digital copies available, so maybe if they could go scan things, they could bring it back. The data on firms we could bring back more easily, but yeah, I think we'd have to use sort of a less good regulation measure to go further back. One kind of similar thing I would like to do though is like all this is just at the federal level. I think in your typed up questions somebody mentioned states, and that's something I'd like to know more about. We've got you can get these measures of how business is doing in different states very easily. And people haven't done this regulatory measure for different states yet, because you gotta go train your text analysis on 50 different state codes, but it's a possibility. I'm optimistic some people do it.
So for people who are not economists, what do you think is the most interesting takeaway?
So the interesting policy takeaway, is think twice before you say there ought to be a law, there ought to be a regulation, right? You're sort of contributing to this process that can make it harder for businesses to start and harder for people to get jobs. But I think the most interesting theoretical takeaway, right, is to realize that business isn't a monolithic block, right? That you can have regulations that are helping big firms and hurting small firms. And so if you see businesses advocating for a regulation, right, and saying like, sometimes people see that and you think, if even businesses are saying we need more regulation, then of course we do, right? Because they're always so conservative or whatever, right? But no, sometimes regulation is exactly what they want, exactly the way they're trying to keep down the little guy. So think through the sort of the game aspects of the situations a little bit, about are you finding there's a really subtle way to shut down your small competitors and sort of make an unfair playing field for the big incumbents. So I don't know if this means you should trust business less or trust them more, but it's maybe both. Yeah.
Other questions?
Are there any other countries that have similar data that it might be easier to do this on?
So I don't know about data exactly like this where we could do the cross-industry thing. That's something I should look into. People have done a lot of cross-country studies before, and I like the World Bank papers. So the World Bank does this Doing Business Index, where they try to figure out, they've done it since 2002, I think, where they try to figure out how many days it takes to start a legal business in your country. And so they started doing this by getting people to actually go try to start a business. And now they survey existing business owners. You can see like If you do everything by the book, which in some countries nobody does because it takes you 10 years to do it by the book, you know, how many days and how much money would it take to actually legally get your business going? And there's huge variation. The U.S. actually does very, very well on that front, and so you can try to see, you know, how important is this for the number of businesses you get. And people have done that, and they see it's important, you know, and I think that one's a little more obvious, right? Is that that's specifically about starting a business. So like, yes, if you make it harder and more expensive to start a business, people won't start as many businesses. You know, I think I would like to, you know, find more general measures of regulation across countries, so you can say things like, well, when people are more forward-looking, if it's easy to start a business, but you see trouble ahead, you know, to what extent is that's still the truth? So I guess the answer is I don't know, but I'd like to find out.
On that note, anything? Professor Bailey?
Thanks.